So 50% of new hires, the executive new hires, fail within 18 months. That's a crazy statistic. And when we say fail, we don't just mean they get fired. We mean sometimes they struggle to meet the job requirements. Sometimes they got to get retrained, and sometimes they get moved to another position. Since we're in the city of medicine, I'll relate this. If you were going to see a doctor and you had to have a routine medical procedure, and I told you there's 50% probability you have a good outcome, you'd be excited, right? Well, if you need a reference, I have some doctors I can refer you to with that, if you find 50% acceptable. Obviously, it's not, and hiring is a routine process. It's not brain surgery. At least it shouldn't be. So if that's the case, why is there such a low success rate with new hires executives? Well, I'm going to use the analogy of a medical since we're in the city of medicine. So I go to the doctor's office. I've got a headache, a raging headache, right? And they take, after they verify I can actually pay and read old magazines for a while, I actually get to see a doctor. And the doctor begins by asking me questions, right? Asking me about my history, kind of looking at my report and trying to add some color to it by asking me questions about my health situation. Then, of course, they've got a reflex to a team consult. So all of a sudden, they are surrounded by a bunch of people in white coats. They look very interested in whatever you're telling them or whatever's going on. But of course, they're scribbling and won't show it to you like a Seinfeld episode. So you're not quite sure what they're writing, but you're certainly the focus. And by the way, after all this consultation, they've made a decision, right? They've made a decision. And guess what? I'm going to have surgery this afternoon. Now, if that's your outcome, I think you can run very fast out the door. And why do I say that? What have they neglected? What's a negligent omission? If there's any lawyers in here or any pre-law, you're probably leaning forward going, this sounds like malpractice. And you go, yeah, it is. Why? What's missing? What have they not considered in this scenario? Well, you guessed it. They haven't run any tests. No diagnostic tests. They didn't want to be slowed down by any data. They had all this intuition and observation and collective perspective that they decided, hey, Chris, you need neurosurgery. We all agree, so you're good to go, right? And you say, no, not yet. So why do I talk about this in relation to hiring? Well, 75% of companies rely on a process that's very similar to that. They don't do diagnostic assessments. They just do interviews and other things, and we'll show you a little bit about how that relates to the medical example. So, of course, my patient record's like the resume, right? You go in there. The only difference between the patient record and the resume is the patient record probably has little less fiction involved in it. So that's the medical analogy. Now you've got the nice group that's going to interview you, the team interview, right? So this is great, right? So you have everyone bringing their collective biases together to look at you and make a decision by asking you behavioral questions that they saw on the internet that Google uses. And then they say, you know what? At this point, we're ready to make an offer. Don't let the data slow you down. I mean, we're ready to make a decision to hire you without any data, anything that's robust or diagnostic in any sense of the word. We're ready to roll. And why do we do this? When we already know there's studies that say that when you do cognitive and behavioral assessments, there's almost a 2x predictive value in whether a candidate's going to be successful in a job. 75% of the companies don't use that, but that's data. That's true. So what is we know the cost of measuring, to do it wrong is very expensive. We all know the cost of churn, right? It's very disruptive, but we don't measure. We still prevents people from doing the diagnostic piece. And then we've got our lying brain, which is interesting, right? So there's a thing called cognitive biases. There's only about 54 of them. My favorite one is confirmation bias, which is when you're doing an interview and you basically rule out anything that doesn't reflect what you believe. It's kind of what you see on C-SPAN in politics. If it doesn't fit what I believe, it's not true. This is a good example visual of Miller-Lyer model. These are really the same length, these lines. And despite, you can tell people all the neurological rationale for it, people still see this, that they're not the same. This is a screenshot from my kids' video game. My kids use more data than most people use to hire to make their decisions on who's going to be on their team in FIFA. That's more data than most companies use. All right, does your approach need refreshing? Do you have confirmation bias replete in your process? Do you use more data than my kids do to make decisions about who should be on the bus and in the seat? If you don't, I hope you feel lucky. And I'm not Clint Eastwood. Do you feel lucky? It's astounding to me with all the data out there that companies are still making decisions based on intuition, in instinct with all the confirmation bias and all the other factors we talked about. Thank you very much.